Welcome to the Continuing Education module, Selecting Interventions for Key Wellness Targets, Choosing Your Strategies for Change. The agenda for this particular module includes some key definitions, our program goals, program model options, and then possible program interventions for major program targets, and then a summary of key points. Our key definitions start with prevention target, and we define a prevention target as a health risk or behavioral target that is the programming focus of a worksite wellness program. And essentially, all prevention targets have some behavioral component to them. Program intervention we are defining as the specific activity used to address or remedy a prevention target in the context of a worksite wellness program. So that's what our context is for this particular issue. Intervention effectiveness is what we call the extent to which a specific program intervention addresses a prevention target, usually in the context of percent change in the metric describing the prevention target. So we tend to want to use a percent change orientation attached to the metric, which is a reflection of the underlying prevention target. Intervention efficiency we are defining as the relationship of the level of effort or unit cost of the specific intervention, usually in the context of a percent change in the metric describing the prevention target. So when we talk about efficiency, we're really talking about the amount of effort or the amount of cost involved in a change of a specific percentage point or points in the context of the metric that describes a specific prevention target. So these are the key definitions that we'll be working with in this module. Typical program goals include the following. Generally, wellness programs are designed to improve employee health, to reduce the growth of future health costs, to reduce health risk in the population, and that can be both frequency and severity, save money for the employer, so that's where we're dealing with the issues of it's the relationship of the wellness program to health plan cost, sick leave absenteeism, workers' compensation costs, disability insurance, short and long term, and presenteeism related cost. Enhance employee productivity by whatever measure we're using to denote that. Satisfy employee needs, and that's a satisfaction related issue. Improve recruitment and retention of employees. Change the organizational culture. So these are very typical program goals. They can be prioritized, but these are the kinds of things that we see in the goal structures of most programs. Now, our major program models we want to highlight are the feel-good model, which is more the morale-oriented case for wellness. The traditional model, which is really more of an activity. It's how much is actually going on with the population. And then results-driven wellness allow us to fine-tune our results around issues like health improvement or the various hierarchical results we associate with wellness programs. Changes in readiness to change, change in attitudes, change in information, change in risk prevalence, change in mitigation of specific health problems or health status measures or healthcare utilization measures or economic measures. So the results-oriented wellness, again, tends to be more oriented toward producing a broader range of results and a larger magnitude of results. When we think about the feel-good wellness program model, its primary targets you can see listed on the left. Our participation is relatively low with this model. We tend to approach a lot of the people that are already intrinsically motivated for wellness. The approximate cost is going to be very low, so we're looking at less than $50 per person per year in the workforce or in the eligible population. Likely ROI it will not likely pay for itself. So it means that we do not usually see a positive return on investment. We don't make enough money to actually pay for this one. There are some exceptions to that at times. Depends on what interventions we use. There might be some way of pulling off some level of return on investment with this, but the amount would be very small because the amount we're spending on the program is very small. So even if you have a 3-to-1 kind of return on investment or cost benefit return or rate of return, that's not going to lead to much money if you're only spending $50 a year to be able to achieve that maybe 2-to-1 cost benefit ratio change. Typical interventions with this area, and we're just going to highlight these and we'll go deeper into them when we look at the big 8. But things like health fairs, lunch and learn sessions, wellness events where we bring people together around a particular issue, community sponsorship of things like 5K runs, chair massage option, free fruit, wellness materials located in the HR department, health cartoons circulated with editorial messages around wellness, nutritious potlucks, movie events, company games. We have seen more of those in the past than we currently see, but the company games are competitive opportunities for teams that represent various employers who then compete with other employer teams. And celebrity event, where we may take a sports figure that can talk about personal excellence or inspiration or improvement, self-improvement, so a variety of different approaches in that context. So these kinds of interventions are associated with this particular feel-good wellness program model. Now, the traditional wellness program model, again, can have anything from the feel-good wellness model, but then we begin to add things like overall wellness score. So we oftentimes are using some sort of well-being assessment or health risk assessment to give people feedback about their overall wellness. Then the issues also may include heart health. So we look at cholesterol levels and fractions, blood lipid fractions, and then blood pressure, as well as tobacco use, obesity, medical self-care, physical activity. So we've added some of that big 8 that we'll go deeper into. Participation is higher than you notice with the feel good. The cost is higher, so it starts at where the feel good leaves off and then goes up a ways. Likely ROI, the literature has approximately 12 studies that have been done on this particular model, and they average about 3.0. So if we kind of cut that in half, we're dealing with a 1 to 1.5 or 150% to 300% return on investment. The typical interventions that we are generally thinking of with this particular model are things like anything that we want to carry forward from that feel-good wellness model. Plus, we start adding a regular health risk assessment or well-being assessment, biometric testing, fitness clubs membership or facility discounts, weight management program at work, smoking cessation program, web-based health information, healthy cafeteria and vending options, a self-care book. We are then usually looking at some form of preventive medical benefit coverage attached to our health plan coverage, wellness newsletter, short-term incentive programs. So these are some of the typical kinds of interventions. Results-driven wellness program usually includes everything from the traditional wellness model, which may pull some things from the feel-good model, but then we start to broaden our focus to include prevention targets that include productivity issues, injury, and when we say all, we're talking about worksite injury prevention, home injury prevention, vehicular or travel-related injury prevention, and recreational injury prevention. Healthcare utilization issues, so we start to get into consumer health issues and medical self-care kinds of issues. Then the ability for us to also have information about purchasing of healthcare. So that goes along also with our health consumerism related issues. Presenteeism and how we deal with symptoms that we carry into work. Resiliency. So we look at that issue in terms of how responsive we are to the demands of our life and life choices. Integrated programming also comes into play in this particular model as well. And you see the highest rate of participation because we've created usually some pretty powerful incentives. The cost per employee per year is in that 200. It starts where the traditional leaves off and goes up from there. That's what is purchasing and allowing us to purchase a broader range of interventions. Our likely ROI is going to be higher. We're going to see somewhere around a 1 to 2.5 to 1 to 6.5, and that translates into 250 to 650 or so % return on an annual basis from our investment in this type of wellness programming. And this typical interventions include many of the things from the traditional wellness model, but also can include more of an incented and targeting use of a health risk assessment or a well-being assessment. We're going for at least an 80% completion each year of the health risk assessment or the well-being assessment. So we're setting up some incentives around involvement in providing feedback through this type of intervention. We are generally looking at risk stratification kinds of concepts and incented interventions. We're generally doing some telephonic coaching with a portion or all of the population, providing medical self-care and consumer health workshops and/or online or learning management system modules, injury prevention in terms of all of the different areas we mentioned earlier, benefit-linked incentives, and that's oftentimes attached to a premium differential or a reduced premium contribution level for involvement in achievements in wellness. Our wellness achievement incentives can be criteria-based. They can include both participation as well as outcome-based or health contingent type of incentives. Resiliency initiative for productivity, spouses being served as well, so that strengthens our behavioral effectiveness by having a family-oriented approach to wellness, but also can affect the spouses which may be on our health plan. So there's two major reasons why we want to extend wellness to spouses. This also begins to deal with integrated programming. So we're looking at the 3 levels of integration, the level at which the individual wellness activities are integrated with each other. The level 2 is where our wellness program is integrated with different activities that are functionally aligned that may go on in the worksite, like EAP or benefits, or how our benefits are structured in terms of their support for wellness. The level 3 integration tends to be with external entities. So that's connecting with our local community. It may be connecting with national resources or other low-cost resources that are provided on a national basis. So again, these are the typical interventions you might see with the results-driven wellness program model. We're going to go deeper and cross-cut from the issue of the big 8 in a moment. And we are generally using the results-driven wellness framework. That framework has metrics, needs and metrics that are examined. We then are doing a planning process that results in a list of interventions. We implement those interventions, then we look for intermediate results indicating that the behavior is changing and health status is changing. And then we're looking at ultimate results, which may be both in an ROI mode from the economic variables and a VOI mode, which may look at other things which are not easy for us to put into monetary or monetize for our senior management. So again, these are the typical interventions associated with the results-driven wellness program model. Now, the big 8 targets we're going to start with are physical activity, and we'll take each of these in turn, tobacco use, stress management, heart health, weight management, nutrition, medical self-care, and back care and back pain prevention. These are our big 8 targets. We're going to start with these and then talk a little bit about how each of these might be addressed in terms of our choice of interventions. Let's start with physical activity. And our physical activity behavioral targets are broken down into aerobic, stretching and flexibility, and strength or resistance training. The health risks we are generally addressing with physical activity are the sedentary lifestyle, a lack of physical conditioning, inflexibility, and metabolic syndrome. So those are oftentimes the areas where we are focused around physical activity. Typical interventions, and I'll just mention one of or something about each one of these as we unfold them. The first one is the health risk assessment. So if I want to address the physical activity and I want to capture and put it into the framework that is associated with the results-driven wellness model, I'm going to have to ask certain kinds of questions in the HRA. So the significance of the choice of this intervention is this is my main way of beginning to get some sense of the behavior pattern going on with a workforce. If I have an on-site fitness facility, I may be in a location where that's an appropriate intervention. So we in fact want to have that perk available to employees at headquarter locations and large settings so that there's actually makes it easy as possible for that fitness facility to help people continue to be physically active. The intervention that has to do with a corporate discount is being able to help people utilize and become members of local fitness facilities. This is also a very low cost option for us. So we can set it up so that people benefit from it. We don't need to reimburse them or subsidize them for the fee for the fitness facility, but we can in fact negotiate corporate discounts and make them available to people to encourage their choice and use of those facilities. A walking program is likely to be low cost. It does require some effort at setup, and it also requires some intervention to in fact keep it going and keep it strong. So we can also organize our walking program so that we address the level of walking that people are doing. So you can have teams of walkers that are in fact doing a fast walk versus those that are new to it doing a slow walk. And also distance can be an issue as well. So those are oftentimes involved in our decision of what kind of intervention in terms of walking program we might choose. Also, if our budget is not very large, we'll probably select something like a walking club. Aerobic training can be put on in the work site. Usually it's done so that people can either access it in a flex time arrangement or at a particular time in the day when it doesn't become invasive to the underlying work productivity that the employer desires. We also can do yoga, which allows us both the stretching, flexibility, conditioning kinds of issues, but also the stress reduction kinds of things. So if I want to have those needs addressed, that's oftentimes a way that I can do that. Flex time for exercise would be another policy. It doesn't have a direct cost attached to it, but it does require approval and supervisory involvement in terms of allowing people to have some flexibility during their workday to actually do and be involved in physical activity. A sports and recreation league, and this was a much bigger deal, particularly in the aircraft industry across the country. They were some of the early, very strong sponsors of fitness centers for employees, community rec kinds of centers, and then the use of sports leagues to actually help people develop relationships, but also to be involved in things that were healthy for them. Online tracker would be another way to help the individual who tends to want to exercise alone, not in a sports context or in a group context. So my choice of that intervention for this area would really be to help address almost the introvert portion of our workforce. And I haven't seen any good research on what proportions those are in different industries, but I do believe my own experience leads me to believe that there is a different, introvert extrovert combination as you look at different job classifications and different industries. So we in fact usually have at least probably a quarter to a half of a workforce being introvertish and wanting to do things by themselves. So the online tracker is really a device to help people that are particularly in that introvertish leaning. And then the issue around wearables. So I would want to know, do I have the APIs, the application programming interfaces that would allow me to upload data from wearables into an incentive program? Can I, in fact, provide those to my employees? Do I want to subsidize them? All of those kinds of issues. I think we have actually entered into a belief that the wearables could be the core of most of a existing corporate wellness program. I have not found those to have very much sustainability. So I think they're good tools, but they need to be alongside of an AMSO structure or construct in order for them to be effective. Also, the different wearables that are marketed have different characteristics, which either are good or bad depending on the individual's needs. So the link with the type of wearable and the type of individual propensity for certain behaviors, like loading and manually loading some of the information and remembering to do that, is going to affect the effectiveness of that particular intervention. So we're going to look at the end of this time period of looking at the Big 8. We'll look at some of the criteria that are usually used in this intervention. But while I'm talking about these typical interventions associated with the Big 8, you can begin to start listening for what are some of those criteria that I talk about that have to do with the choice of an intervention linked to a specific target. And YouTube videos that may provide both inspiration as well as some basic skill information about becoming more active, integrating more physical activity into your lifestyle. Those kinds of things can be free. They simply need to be made available and easily presentable, easily utilizable by and easily accessible by employees. Now, tobacco use, the behavioral targets we're generally focused on are smoking, cigars and pipes, smokeless tobacco, more recently vaping, and how that particular method of getting nicotine into the blood is in fact addressed. Where the health risk we're generally focused on is the smoking and the nicotine addiction issues. The typical interventions that we would generally have, the HRA is going to be the way that we find out what's the pattern and how is it changing in terms of this particular practice. Smoke-free policy would be another thing which we implement, where it's not a direct cost, but it does have some cost implications in terms of reminding people and being able to follow up and do enforcement around issues of tobacco use and smoking behavior in the worksite. Smoking cessation programs, so we have the traditional programs that are multi-session that people are going through. That can also be carried out now in a coaching mode. So that's another one of the ways that we oftentimes address this particular target. Education can both be for the individual that's in the pre-contemplation mode, or those that are in contemplation, or those that are in preparation to change. So a variety of different approaches to the education around tobacco use issues. Coaching we mentioned before as being one of the ways that we can help people with behavior change and developing new habits around their smoking behavior. Nicotine replacement therapy, over the counter as well as prescription, is another component that helps a segment of the workforce be able to effectively kick the habit and create a healthier habit around the use of tobacco. And e-cigarette or vaping would be another intervention in terms of a transitional intervention for people away from actual smoking tobacco to these other forms of nicotine provision. And then online modules linked to a learning management system can be either a single one or multiple sessions around issues. We can also do something like improve the health of smokers so that they are as healthy as they possibly can be as they decide to continue to smoke for a lifetime. So there's the issues of how do we reduce the potential adverse effects on health that results from a regular smoking behavior. And YouTube videos can be another source of intervention that we might choose. They're low cost. They can have an inspirational nature to them. They also can allow a kind of a momentum to build so that we can in fact help people move from one kind of intervention to another and then continue to work on their effectively making a behavior change or forming a new habit. When we talk about habits, we're generally talking about cues that cue the habit, a routine, which is a behavioral sequence that it usually is either unhealthy. We're trying to get people to leave the unhealthy behavior routine behind and choose a healthier behavior routine, and then a reward, and the rewards that I get from whatever that behavior is. So that's where both the intrinsic and extrinsic issues come into play around the reward that I associate with a specific behavior. So our context here is we're looking for interventions that are helping people formulate those new healthier habits and to maintain those over time. Stress management is the next area of the Big 8. Our behavioral targets are going to be stress management practices. So that's oftentimes physical activity as a way of breaking up the chemistry and the chemical reactions and metabolic reactions of stress, using relaxation, either progressive relaxation or just straight relaxation techniques, and dealing with resilience. So those are some of the behavioral targets that we break down under this particular area. The health risks that we're generally dealing with here are the experiencing chronic excess stress, high levels of long-term high stress, and somatic complaints. And the somatic complaints is part of what's called somatization disorders. They are a set of disorders that are reflected in people who can experience stress and then manifest that stress in usually in physical ways. So that may be a sleep disorder, or it may be an issue of migraines, or it may be a depression in immune function and immune system function. So there's a variety of different ways that people manifest that somatization disorder. Typical interventions can include the HRA, and again, we're finding out what the patterns are out there. And the larger the percentage of the population completing an HRA each year, the more authority, the more validity I have in addressing the issue of what's happening around the health of my population. Stress workshop, so a stress management workshop, we can have quiet space. So that's a way where if we have some dedicated space and we have a way of being able to have some accountability there so that people don't abuse it, the ability to pull back and to regroup from the stress issues that you're facing. That would be the quiet space kind of concept. We can have some resilience education, so we can learn a little bit more about becoming more hardy and being able to respond to the demands that our life choices bring us. We can do yoga, which affects both the conditioning, stretching, flexibility, as well as stress-related issues. Time management workshop, so that's the issue around the pressures that come along with our use of time and how we look at time in terms of our daily life choices. Stretching breaks can kind of break up the physical, metabolic phenomena of stress. So those stretch breaks can be integrated into a ergonomically sensitive computer program, or it can be just reminders that we program for ourselves to take a stretch break or get up and walk around, but breaking up the pattern, particularly as we see some of the risk issues of the science behind the people in terms of their sitting and how long they sit for and how much risk is associated with someone who is inactive and does not get up, does not move around, does not change their location or their position, their physical position. Coaching would be another intervention around stress, so helping people with both the cognitive behavioral therapy is one of the major ways that we work on various kinds of behaviors and various issues affecting mental well-being. We have issues that obviously also affect us in terms of depression or anxiety, or how our sleep patterns are affected by these underlying phenomena. So coaching would be a way to be able to help people become more aware, learn new skills, and then practice those new skills. Online modules in a learning management system can be a single module or multiple modules. They can be sequential. They can break things down into different areas and allow people to pursue the topics that they feel are relevant. So lots of different options around that area. And then YouTube videos, again, being able to get, for instance, things like TED Talks on the physiology of stress and how to interrupt it. So there's a lot of good material that we can access that is free. The main issue there is how do we get people to be able to access those types of activities and to expose themselves to some things that are going to help move them along on a continuum of behavior. So those are some of the typical interventions around the area of stress management. Now, heart health, our behavioral targets are oftentimes blood pressure screening, knowing our numbers, and then knowing also our cholesterol testing numbers. So total serum cholesterol, the HDL, LDL, VDHL, there's a whole HDL ratio, lots of different aspects to the cholesterol testing. Medication non-compliance, so if we are taking and are supposed to take blood pressure medication or cholesterol reduction or modification medication, then how much compliance do we have with that? The health risk we're generally addressing in this area is hypertension, also prehypertension, hypercholesterolemia, and the issues around sedentary lifestyle and metabolic syndrome. So those are oftentimes the health risks that we're focused on in heart health. When we talk about interventions, the HRA is giving us, again, an insight into the pattern of behavior, the pattern of risk in our population. We also can use a blood pressure sweep. That's where we have the people who can do blood pressure actually go around to the individual in their work location and ask if they would like their blood pressure measured. So we get a much higher proportion of people who do the blood pressure testing. And then if it is elevated, we can then make some plans for people to come back in, and we can in fact make a note and then make sure that they do come back in to have an elevated blood pressure perhaps redone or looked at. Cholesterol testing would be another issue. So the ability for us to have either finger stick or venipuncture and then to break out the cholesterol testing into the different lipid fractions. Biometric screening can incorporate a number of these things, so that's oftentimes how we put it all together. We can have the HRA along with a number of different kinds of screening tests. Blood pressure monitoring, so if we know we have some elevated blood pressure problems, we may be under medication, but if we want to monitor those, we oftentimes can set up some processes to help people both be involved in the feedback on that as well as to carry out the monitoring process. And then the issue around medication, we can have a coaching intervention to help people with the lifestyle components of this. We can provide online modules on the learning management system. We can do some food access issues. We can in fact affect a number of these areas with an eHealth portal that's got the capability to address these different heart health issues. And now in this particular part of the Big 8 in weight management, we can look at the behavioral targets that include eating habits, food access, some of the emotional aspects or psychosocial dimensions of food and nutrition practices. Our health risks tend to be a sedentary lifestyle, that's inactivity. It may be sitting for long periods of time as well as a subcomponent of that sedentary lifestyle risk. And then overweight, and then the obesity through 1 through 4. So the ability to look at the BMI levels of the individual and then to look at the various categorizations of overweight and obesity. And then metabolic syndrome is where we put a number of these together. That's basically the issue that has to do with the development of chronic diseases, particularly atherosclerotic heart disease, and the issues around diabetes. And the typical interventions that we generally look at under weight management are, again, a health risk assessment. It may include a component that is part of biometric screening that takes measurements, that takes weight and height and or circumference measures, waist measures, or other parts of the body in terms of measurement. So we can in fact incorporate that within an HRA. We can upload that biometric data into the HRA before it is run and before it establishes an overall wellness score or does risk indices of different types. We can use food diaries to help us and help people get a handle on their consumption of food. We can deal with how the choices are laid out and arrayed around food access and the choices they have. We can also deal with pricing on foods in terms of creating some greater incentive for healthier food choice. We can do a weight management program like a Weight Watchers at Work or something like that. We can do and have bariatric surgery coverage, so we can have a number of the different surgical procedures that are done to help people with obesity, particularly categories 2, 3, and 4 in terms of obesity levels. We can do support groups to help people around the interventions. We can also have scales in the bathrooms that are calibrated to provide a more accurate weight for individuals, so we can help them monitor and be involved in the feedback process around their weight. We can also have the opportunity for coaching and YouTube visits or YouTube videos to be able to be used to both provide the inspiration or the motivation and or some of the skill-based learning that's necessary for successful behavior change. And finally, we can also have online modules that are part of an LMS, a learning management system, that either break down the issues around weight management into multiple issues or address them in terms of a more comprehensive single types of modules on weight management. So these are some of again, the typical interventions that we're using. Some are connected to benefits, some have direct cost, others are low cost. We have usually a one, you buy a set of scales and then you use them for a number of years. So those scales can be another strategy in terms of intervention and choice. The next area of the Big 8 is nutrition, and our behavioral targets are nutrition practices and also food purchasing skills. So our ability to read labels, our ability to look at costs of various foods, the choices that we make for substitution of foods. So there's a variety of different things that have to do with recipe substitutions as well as other things. So there's lots of behavioral targets in the nutrition area. The dietitians and nutritional specialists are the people who really focus on this technical area. And the health risk that we're oftentimes looking at is our consumption levels of fruits and vegetables, the issue around the composition of our diet in terms of the protein, carbohydrates, fats, the high-fat food avoidance, salt avoidance, and water intake. So those are oftentimes the health risk issues that we look at in this particular area. Our typical interventions include the HRA, again looking at nutrition behavior as reflected by the kinds of questions that can be asked in a well-being assessment or an HRA. Food diaries, so we're helping people track their actual consumption. Cafeteria options, vending machine options, nutritional potlucks, so we have an opportunity to taste foods that are healthily or prepared in a healthy way, and then we can also look at the recipes for how those foods can be prepared in our own home after having some of the opportunity to experience the taste of those foods. We can do cooking demos to show people techniques for healthy eating. We can provide coaching opportunities. Some of the coaching, by the way, there are products out there now that allow us to basically to use our smartphone, take a picture of the food that we're going to consume right at the beginning of the meal, and then send that off to a dietitian who then gives us feedback on what we might do to either reduce the caloric content of our next meal and or provide some insight into what healthier foods could we substitute or use versus the ones that we are actually consuming. So those are coaching opportunities. eHealth portal may have multiple materials, multiple functional capability to look at nutrition practices and nutrition issues. Our online modules as part of an LMS can in fact again break this down into component parts or address the healthy eating in a broader context. And YouTube videos are another way in which this particular area can be addressed by having motivational talks, TED Talks, and other kinds of modules that are available on YouTube or Vimeo. And smartphone apps would be another way of being able to create some of these behavioral supports in an intervention around these particular behavioral targets and health risks. Medical self-care is our next area of the Big 8. Our behavioral targets are medical self-care software or book use. So we are actually dealing with the use of these resources. There are behaviors that are also behavioral targets that come out of that may have to do with things like home diagnostic use or techniques for being able to help people heal or recover from different kinds of conditions or in different morbidity, illness and injury. The health risk we generally are dealing with includes symptom ignorance. So there are some symptoms that are more significant than others, and knowing what those are and when you need to be aware or desire additional medical advice is part of that health risk. Chronic disease management, what we call tertiary prevention. So once we have a diagnosis, are we in fact managing that condition effectively? Well, some of our disease management helps with that particular skill. Inadequate home care and patient non-compliance, that's where we don't follow through. We actually, as employers, pay for a good deal of health care, and in a very significant portion of that health care, the individual usually ignores the recommendations or the advice of the clinicians involved. So we have some of that always at some level going on in all populations. And then iatrogenic risk stands for, iatro is the Greek word for physician, and genetic or genic is the induced. So it's physician induced or health system induced or hospital induced risk. So those are what we oftentimes call patient safety issues. They come into play in terms of being able to avoid some of the injuries and the illnesses that can be, in a sense, received from things that happened to us when we're getting health care. So that's another one of the areas of health risk associated with medical self-care and these behavioral targets. Now, typical interventions for those, the HRA again is going to give us the insight into current status and trends related to these issues. The PCP requirement may essentially say to people, we believe that it's best for you to have a PCP. You pick who you want, but you need to have somebody that's helping you navigate through the healthcare system. And educational workshop on medical self-care. We used to do a lot of these with medical self-care books that were given out. The American Institute of Preventive Medicine still has a number of those different books that are available for purchase and use. So those books then provide an opportunity in a classroom setting for people to have a vignette given to them where they say, here's your situation, and then that situation, you go through the detail, and then you ask the person, now you know what your situation is, use the book to find out what to do about it, and then have them do that 2, 3, 4 times. That usually helps their confidence level go up, their what's called self-efficacy go up, and their consumer skills go up. So they in fact are then better able to use medical self-care resources as a result of that type of educational intervention. The eHealth portal, and that by the way, we used to put into the open enrollment sessions that people would have at the time that they were looking at new benefit changes and benefit choices. The eHealth portal can in fact have that. When I was with WebMD, the WebMD.com public site was used by some 62 million individual unique users each month. So those are people that are going into that portal to actually, in most cases, want to look at the symptom checker software. That is now available for actual a free app on your smartphone. So if you download the WebMD smartphone app from your app store, you can in fact have that entire technology on your own smartphone. So that's eHealth portal intervention. It's rolled into a number of other things, so it's bundled usually, and then it can in fact support some of these low-cost smartphone apps as well. And then the use of a personal health record, so the ability for us to keep in one place all of our family health-related issues and our personal health-related issues, and to have those accessible to various providers when we choose to give them the information about where it is. And that can be in the cloud. It can be a way in which we keep our information. We can encrypt it. We can put password protection on it. So lots of different ways of being able to use that specific intervention around our health. Health unit support would be if we're in a situation where there is an occupational health unit. The occupational health nurse is oftentimes helpful in terms of medical self-care information and advice. And then the ability to use online modules and a learning management system again. And again, you can have multiple modules or single modules. You can incorporate some tests and some incentives around people's response to various vignettes. So lots of different options around that. The health advice line, and particularly demos on what a health advice line call is like, will generally lead to much greater use of that intervention in helping people deal with the medical self-care issues they're facing. Smartphone apps I mentioned, in terms of you can go into your app store and put in disease conditions or medical self-care or other search terms, and you can find a whole series of free apps that can be used to help in this area. And then YouTube videos, again, would be a low-cost option to help people make choices around the videos, particularly if they're technology users or they are younger and like to see things in a video context or DVD context. That's another one of the interventions that is useful around this particular area of the Big 8. Now, our last area of the Big 8 is back care or back pain prevention. And our behavioral targets are things like strength of abdominal muscles, because that's going to affect how much strain is on your back, lifting techniques and how you use them or don't use them, back muscle conditioning, so that's the issue around how we keep our back muscles and abdominal muscles in good condition so that we don't end up with as much strain going on in terms of pain and back pain. Relaxation techniques are also another thing to break up the stress-related response going on in muscles when they become strained and they go into tetany. That tetany translates to pain, so we are trying to keep our muscles from doing that particular thing. The health risk involved has to do with back pain, so we are attempting to work on that particular health risk. The interventions that we generally would look at would again include the HRA in terms of this particular area, the activity that people are engaged in, and the amount of risk experience if they're encountering. In general, according to the National Health Survey for working adults in the U.S., within a 2-year period, 75% of us will experience some sort of back pain. And we will either go into work, we'll stay home, or we'll go seek medical attention, or we'll go get a chiropractic visit, or we'll go get some muscle relaxants from our physician and use our prescription PBM. So those are also some of the interventions around that HRA. We want to know how much of that is going on. Fitness facility use would be another area, particularly where there are specific either equipment and or exercises that people can do to strengthen abdominal muscles, strengthen back muscles, and do some conditioning around those. So fitness facility use would be an intervention for this area. Back care workshops, so finding out more about how to take better care of your back. Lifting techniques, again, to keep the strain, and warm-up, stretching and warm-up activity, how our posture affects some of those low back pain events. Stretching, by the way, in terms of hamstring stretching, which then relieves some of the pressure on the back muscles that tend to go into tetany, which then tend to be very painful for us. Stress reduction techniques that are used to help reduce the psychogenic component of those muscle problems and back pain. And then LMS modules, so the learning management system modules on this particular issue would be another one of the areas that we might use for intervention, particularly if we already have an LMS system and we can either purchase or gain or make and put together modules to address these issues. And ergonomic interventions, so that we can look at the ergonomics of our driving setups in terms of our positions of our seat and our back, and what kind of postural supports there are, as well as our workstation, as well as our ways that we relax, and the types of chairs and furniture that we use, and how do we lay it flat, on our back? Do we pull our legs up and stretch out our hamstrings, and those kinds of things as ways of being able to avert the the health problem of low back pain. And medications selectively used to help us manage this particular behavioral issue and health risk issue. So again, these are some of the interventions. We talked about different criteria for the choice of one intervention versus another, but these are some of the ways in which we can look at this issue. Now, the criteria for selection of interventions are going to include the relationship to the target behavior. So our intervention may be off, kind of off the target, or it may be in, something that's a precursor, or something that's a post phenomena. So we have to be careful that our interventions are designed to really affect directly the target and or the health risk that we're going after. The cost of the intervention is going to be an issue. So we are going to want to use both low cost and moderate cost interventions. We're also going to want to, in those cases where we have a lot of people doing a particular intervention, we want to look at economies of scale. So we want to be able to get a lower unit cost for the delivery of an intervention that addresses a target directly. The difficulty of the intervention in terms of what's needed, you notice that in many of the interventions we talked about related to the Big 8, they were essentially free or in the public sector, already set up, and the only thing we're doing is we're allowing people access to a YouTube or a Vimeo, or a Vimeo video, or a free app that can be downloaded. So the difficulty of the intervention is going to be involved in our selection and use of those. The efficiency of the intervention is that issue of how much does it essentially cost us in either labor and or manual activity, or cost, direct cost, to have that intervention delivered to a specific individual. So that's our efficiency. And we're looking at the percent change in the underlying metric, or the underlying metric reflection of that behavior or that need that we're trying to address. The likely short-term effectiveness of the intervention. So we have an immediate issue versus the longer-term kinds of effectiveness. Does this provide some temporary relief? Does it fix it for a short time period? And then do we need to do a different intervention to get that long-term effectiveness in place? So that differentiation between our short-term effectiveness and long-term effectiveness also comes into play when we're really talking about the criteria for the selection of specific interventions. And then we want to know, does the intervention have any kind of proven relationship to any of the economic effects or variables that we're attempting to look at? And again, in a broad-based, results-driven wellness program situation, we want to be looking at health plan cost. We want to look at the issue of sick leave absenteeism, the effects on that, the issue of the incidence and severity of workers' compensation claims, the incidence and severity of short-term disability, long-term disability effects, and then we want to be looking at the presenteeism-related effects that come along with a particular workforce and a particular situation. So these are the criteria that I would suggest to you are the ones that are probably the most effective for us to use in sorting through interventions and matching them to our prevention targets. Again, we want to overlay that the 4 keys to an effective wellness program. So if we think about how to make sure that our various interventions and prevention targets that they're addressing are effective, is to include and make sure we have an ongoing method for raising the awareness in each individual around health and wellness issues for them, so their own personal awareness issues. We also need to have the ability to enhance the motivation, the intrinsic motivation that exists in a population, and to enhance that usually with extrinsic motivation. And that's where our thoughtful and careful use of incentives comes in. They're also using different incentive pay values, some 25 different types of value that we can build into incentive programming. And then the third area is under AMSO. So we've done the awareness, the motivation. The S stands for learning new skills associated with a new wellness behavior. So we have to have some way of imparting to people, how do you learn how to eat, eat in a healthy way when you're on the road? What are the skills that are necessary for you to be a regular user of a fitness facility? How do you build walking and increased walking activity into your lifestyle? So whatever the change in terms of new behavior, we generally are using and needing to know new skills associated with that new behavior. And then the O in AMSO is your program has to provide opportunities for practicing those new behavioral skills. So we need to have that addressed as we think about all those interventions we were talking about. So some of the interventions we just went through with the Big 8 look at awareness. Others look at more of a motivational aspect. Others look at the new skill acquisition. And others are structuring opportunities to practice those new behavioral skills so that they become assimilated into our self-concept of who we are and also become the new healthy routine in new habits. And again, habits have a cue, they have a routine, and they have a reward. And the reward can be either an intrinsic reward or a reward that is in the extrinsic mode. So it's outside the individual. So we want to be wise in our choice of how we address both those intrinsic sources as well as the intrinsic sources, the extrinsic and the intrinsic. So again, the AMSO concept overlays everything we just went through in terms of your prevention targets that you're addressing and the interventions that we want to link to those prevention targets. Now, a summary of key points for this module include prevention targets and interventions should be primarily shaped by your program objectives. So program objectives and your goals are going to help you in terms of your choice of which targets you're going to look at and which interventions you're going to choose. There is a core set of prevention targets and interventions that almost all wellness programs should be addressing. And we believe those are the Big 8. So those are the ones that we feel should be addressed by all wellness programs. A set of similar interventions apply to most of those prevention targets. So we can have an HRA that addresses all 8 of them. So the opportunity for us to think through our interventions and how those interventions affect the various prevention targets we're working on. Using personal information in interventions is becoming more important. So instead of just using a particular intervention without any tailoring or profiling to the individual or personalization to the individual, we get much more effect out of this if we can modify our interventions and have them actually reflect some of the characteristics, desires, readiness to change, learning styles of individuals. Each of the major program models has a set of typical interventions. So we oftentimes put coaching into an intervention as a standard intervention, or biometric testing, or a fitness facility. So we are generally doing some common typical interventions, and then we augment those with other areas. So program interventions can be consolidated yet be driven by individual needs and preferences. So that's where we are doing much more tailoring in our programming, and we do that much more in the results-driven wellness model. The next area, and summary of key points, is wellness incentive criteria combined with larger value rewards have the potential to increase the use and effectiveness of interventions. So if we can get a premium reduction, a premium contribution reduction of $600 to $1,200 a year per person for meeting a number of different wellness criteria, that's probably the best way that we can use to actually increase the effectiveness and the participation levels in our program. Continuity and follow-up are keys to intervention effectiveness. So that consistency of the continuity and the follow-up activities to, in fact, keep people moving in a direction of change is, in fact, important for the intervention effectiveness. The mix of interventions is a critical choice of program managers. So our mix is going to change over time, but it is a critical choice that we make as program managers. Many interventions can be improved with each program cycle. So we can look at the intervention we're doing and ask the question, how can this be improved? And that's oftentimes what we want to be doing in what's called formative evaluation, the evaluation that is carried out to be able to help us do a better job and have more effective programs. The wellness program needs to address all the elements of the AMSO construct. So our wellness program needs to address every part of that four-part AMSO construct. Now, some key questions we want to pursue is, first one is, what framework or construct, a little hint here, has the most potential to improve the effectiveness of our program? It's probably the AMSO construct. So that actually, I believe, and I think the research, supports this position, that AMSO is really critical to will our program actually lead to long-term behavior change. Second question is, what are the major types of programming interventions? So if we think about that, we can think about from a technology base. We can think about it from the type of function, like a coaching function. We can think about it from a testing function. We can think about it from an activity orientation. We can think about it related to a specific risk factor or prevention target. So lots of different kinds of types of program interventions. We also have the general interventions of education that can come from YouTube or Vimeo, that can also be smartphone apps or low cost or free apps for our smartphone. So we have all of those different kinds of interventions. Third question is, what types of interventions can be incorporated into a virtual program infrastructure? So if you think about smartphone apps, you think about e-health portals, you think about some sort of annual or maybe more than just once a year, but there may be what's called a drip HRA in addition to an annual HRA, and that's where we break down the HRA into smaller bites and then have and link offers of different kinds that are related to the issues we've just asked the person about. So if we ask them, are you interested in improving your sleep? And they say yes, then we should have some offers for them that go all the way from TED Talk to interventions where they can actually get a sleep study done. So that's the ability for us to be really thinking about that. Virtual also can have a coaching kind of component, so I don't need to be in the work site to experience that. It can also have a concierge kind of component, so that I may call someone and they can help me find a program that I want and need. So there's lots of different ways in which that virtual program infrastructure or the technology infrastructure can be used to help us scale our wellness efforts. Now that you completed this module, go ahead and take the quiz.